Welcome to Module 2, and we are also in the second week of our class. I'm hoping that you've all gotten acquainted with the material and that you will also be taking a look at my comments for the discussion postings for last week. I'd really love for you guys to take a look at that before you start working on this week's discussion, but we'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute. Let's go through what we have going on here for this module. We will be covering Chapter 3, which is Social Perception, and Chapter 4, the Self. So here's your to-do list. And again, I set it up in a way that this is the order I feel is best to do the work. You definitely want to be doing all of the readings, so the article readings as well as the chapter readings, before you even attempt to post your response to the discussion questions, because the discussion questions require that you pull material from the readings to support what you're saying. And you obviously can't do that if you haven't done the readings. So make sure that you're covering those before you jump in or dive into the discussion posts. You also should be watching any videos because a lot of times the videos help highlight different concepts and talk about the material in ways that will really help you to solidify your understanding and then maybe even give you more to say in your discussion posts. So last week there were not any extra videos. There were just the ones that were embedded in chapters 1 and 2. I think there was only a few. But this week you will have some extra videos that I've posted. So let's skip on down to the chapter objectives. Chapter 3 covers social perception. So it's all about how the world perceives us and how we perceive the world, as well as sort of our motivation. How do we want to be perceived by people? And this idea that we're kind of always engaged in managing the impression that we're making on people. So it's going to talk a lot about perception. If some of you have taken sensation and perception, you know that this is a big deal in the cognitive realm, but it also applies to social psych, because perception is that idea of what people think of us. Okay, so it involves nonverbal communication. You know, what kind of signals are we giving to people through our body language? What cues are leaking that might give away what we're feeling or what we're thinking at any given moment, or might leak out what our ideas are, our opinions are. So there's a really cool video this week that I'm including that looks at all the nonverbals, so micro expressions and posture and hand movements and eye contact. So it's going to be fun. I think that you guys will enjoy the video. It's really going to bring to life a lot of this stuff that we cover in the very beginning of Chapter 3. It'll also dive into talking about deception. How do we detect deception? And that has a connection to your article reading in the discussion post for this week. So here's where you can tie in some of this material and use it to support your answers in your discussion posts. If we go down here, we start getting into some of the theory on social perception. We start looking at what do people pay attention to about others, what internal cues and external cues do we look for, and what do we presume about people's behavior? So when we watch someone doing something, or we see something, let's say, that we don't like, what kinds of ideas do we form about why people do what they do? Do we think that it has to do with who they are, or do we think that it has to do with the external situation or the setting that's happening around them? So it'll dive into fundamental attribution error, which looks at that. We'll look at some of the research on Asch, looking at traits. So here's a little bit of personality psych thrown in here, just looking at traits and how do they contribute to who we are. in terms of our personality. And then lastly, we'll get into impression management. So here is, how do we go about making a first impression? When we want people to think something about us, or we want to give off a idea that, hey, we're smart, or we're confident, or we're capable, how would we go about doing that? Or could we even? So that's the area of impression management. And two, why would we want to do that? Is it being fake, or are there certain situations that call for us to behave a certain way, and we want to try to do our best in those situations to do that? The social perception chapter is also very linked to the self, which is why I like grouping these two chapters together. The self really dives into exploring our personal identity. Who are we? What kinds of things do we think about ourselves? How do we compare ourselves to others? Because you don't know who you are until you have some sort of a benchmark that tells you who you are. Like if you think you are a good artist, how do you know that? Because you draw, or you sculpt, or you paint better than most of your friends? Or because you've seen other people's art and you know yours is better? I mean, what tells you that piece of information? Well, that is social comparison. We're always engaged in the act of comparing ourselves with others. And that this can change over time as we see ourselves differently over time, and with experience and with maturity, our self-esteem changes, and our identity kind of navigates through that, and we start to find where we fit as we grow and we develop our relationships and we have more experiences. So we're going to get into some of the language here that talks about ourself and how we develop our attitudes and our behaviors, and where we start to settle in to some of that. So we get into some of the biases that we have. We make a lot of assumptions about others and about ourselves in that process as we're comparing, and we're taking a look around at other people. We might put up sort of defense mechanisms, I guess, if you will, that help protect our self-esteem in instances where we might feel like we don't measure up. And we might also have inherent biases just based on how we were raised or how we grew up, that we gravitate towards certain aspects of the self. So we'll take a look at a lot of just, again, the language, and there's a lot of definitions in this chapter. But we'll also take a look at, how does one measure the self? How do we know who we are? Like, how can we even tap into that? So we'll take a look at how we measure self-esteem, or how social psychologists typically look at this area of research, and what the results show. And we'll lastly, in the very end of the chapter, we'll start getting into a little bit of some self-evaluations that could be negative, like prejudice and stereotype threat. So it gets into this idea that, we allow our environment, and we allow negative influences to sometimes creep into our self-evaluations. And the fact that we are not all perceived equal. People do have prejudices, and sometimes that those can filter in and affect our own self-evaluation, how we see ourselves. Okay, so then you get into your article readings. You have Article 13 and Article 5. Here are your lecture slides for Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. And here's where we get into the videos. I said we were going to have some extra videos this week. This is just a short little clip here about how media and social media and electronics in particular are affecting how we see ourselves and how we see others. How is this form of media sort of creeping in and taking over when it comes to how we want others to see us. So it has a lot to do with self-perception as well as self-presentation, how we present ourselves to others. This is another quick video about electronic devices again, because that is like the hot topic right now, is looking at how being connected virtually 24/7 is starting to affect our view of ourselves and our self-esteem. It's really starting to leak in and affect some of what we do and some of what we say. All right, you have 2 more videos. One is a little bit longer. This one is awesome though. It comes from the History Channel. I'm sorry, A&E, I think. And it is all about body language. It's about all the behind-the-scenes stuff that we don't normally think of when we're talking or when we're watching someone else give a speech or make an announcement. So it delves into that area of nonverbal communication, and so it looks at body language, eye contact, gestures, voice tone, and how people can actually use it to their advantage, how we can persuade people to do things we want them to do. We can get people to comply with what we're looking for, and establish power. So it looks at some of the greats, all the way back to Churchill, Roosevelt, I think former President Clinton is in there, Barack Obama. We're going to take a look at some of these speakers who are very public people, and take a look at, kind of pick apart their behavior and see how it serves them well or doesn't serve them well, and what kind of cues we can pick up on from learning to do this. And then the Dove Beauty sketch artist will look at the self and self-evaluations. So your discussion for this week relies heavily on you having done the readings and watched those videos, because in the discussions we're going to be talking about first impressions. How long-lasting are there? You want support from the research, not just what you think, but what does research say about how long-lasting first impressions are? Would they persist over the semester or even longer? Here you're asked to extrapolate from the research a little bit and say what you think here. And could you test it? So in other words, set up an experiment to test first impressions. How would you do that? What might it entail? You might need to go back to chapter 1 and kind of look at the research methods and social psych. What elements need to be present to do an experiment, right? So we're thinking about independent variables and dependent variables and control group and all of those things. If you were to develop a question that you're interested in about first impressions, what would that be? And so that's really Article 5 talks all about the research on first impressions. So you're going to want to integrate in Article 5, and you're also going to want to integrate in the reading from Social Perception chapter. And then Article 13 deals more with the self. So here is where Chapter 4 comes into play, because we're talking about low self-monitoring and high self-monitoring. Those are different kinds of individuals. They act differently in social settings as well as even in intimate one-on-one settings. How would they act differently, and what might they be doing in that kind of situation that would give off different cues? So you're going to be talking about that, and you're going to be supporting your answers in doing that, and discussing some of that using the material that you've read. Okay? And then the last thing is your exam. Exam 2 is going to close on June 2nd, and that will wrap up this module. So again, if you have any questions about anything or don't understand anything, please just let me know. Shoot me an email and I will get right back to you. Thanks everyone. Have a great week.